All right. We continue in Esther. We're finishing chapter 2 and starting chapter 3 tonight. And there's 10 chapters in the book. And we're just kind of starting to scratch the surface of it. And I'm going to tell you all the truth. This has been a challenge. I knew that picking a book that never mentions God by name was going to be a challenge, but it has been enjoyable for sure, but a challenge. Trying to pull application out of some of this has been tough. So I thank God that He always seems to provide it to me in the course of my study, and I appreciate you guys letting me use you as my guinea pigs and as I learn to teach. Last week we talked largely about obedience and the importance of it in our Christian lives. Today, we're going to be on a related topic. We're going to talk about obeying civil authorities as well as obeying God and how and where to draw those lines. So over the last couple weeks, I've been studying the lead up to the American Revolution in history and specifically how the religious outlook of the people involved affected it. And this week's verses had me struggling with the question of whether or not the Christians in the colonies were biblically justified to revolt against the government. And I'll tell you, as a person born in this country and a man that deeply loves this country, I want to say yes, but personally, the jury's still out on it. I'll let you know when I finish my Bible study and come to my conclusion. But tonight, what I do want to discuss is what I know based on the fact that I was born 200 years after the Revolution, right? I was born in 1985, and by that time, we had an established country, an established state, an established city. We have a fully complete government with its own rules, laws, and statutes. And so tonight, I won't talk about the Revolution, but you guys know I struggle with introductions, and so sometimes I just tell you what's on my mind and what I've been reading lately, which is why I bring those random books in here and read you out of history. So I guess we're going to read chapter 2, verses 21 through 23, and then chapter 3, verses 1 through 4. And so I'll read them to you, and then we'll begin. In those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs from those who were doorkeepers, became furious and sought to send forth their hand against King Xerxes. But the matter became known to Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther, and Esther said it to the king in Mordecai's name. Then the matter was sought out and found to be true. So they were both hanged on a gallows, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the king's presence. Chapter 3. After these things, King Xerxes magnified Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes who were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate were bowing down and prostrating themselves before Haman, for so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai would not bow down or prostrate himself. So the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you trespass against the king's command?" Now it happened when they had spoken daily to him, and he would not listen to him, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's words would stand. For he had told them that he was a Jew. All right, so if you remember last week, we talked about Esther becoming the queen and being installed as the queen, and now we carry forward with the story. So here we're told Mordecai's at the king's gate, and in the ancient Near East, normally the business of the town and the legal proceedings of the town were done at the gate, right? So that's where the judges and the magistrates would be to provide rulings, witness business transactions, almost like notaries today, right? And so the king's gate would be the entrance to the palace, which is kind of the next level. So here you would have gathered the various men of authority within the city of Susa and the palace of Xerxes to hear and rule on matters and also to certify business transactions. So many people theorize that Mordecai was some sort of palace judge or palatial judge because he always seems to be in and around the palace, though never directly in front of the king. We find out here that Mordecai is, we don't know that, right? I tell y'all when I'm theorizing, but we find out here Mordecai is there, presumably performing his duties, and he overhears a conversation or becomes privy to one anyway. This conversation is between two of the king's eunuchs, who are basically the guards, right? Doorkeepers, guards. And take a moment to note here that a happy accident occurred. He just happened to hear about it. Had he been somewhere else or off doing something else or maybe daydreaming, he would not have become aware of this plot. And what happens as a result of these verses will play into the course of events that occur and lead to the salvation of the Jewish people from the plan that Haman will hatch. So never underestimate the providence of God and the work of his hands in history. I told you last week there's not one rogue molecule in the entire universe. God is in control of all things, and it cannot be overstated how the happy accidents or coincidences in our lives are actually the providence of God at work to carry out his will on earth. Here's one to think about. There was a German priest and monk who was the professor of a college that happened to be studying his scriptures one day and had a realization about what they actually taught. He was looking around at what was happening in his community locally and realized there were some things in his church that weren't proper. And so he wrote out 95 thesis statements that he would be willing to engage in academic debate over. He wrote them all down in Latin, all 95 of them, because Latin was the language of the church, and he nailed them to the church door. Now, a lot of people don't realize, I know until I started studying this seriously, you see pictures of this. I'm talking about Martin Luther, right? When Martin Luther nailed his 95 theses to the church door in Wittenberg, I remember a picture from when I was about her age of Martin Luther standing there and is like pointing to the theses, and he's got a 10-pound sledge in his hand, and there's a whole crowd around him, right? Like he's disturbing the peace when he does this. No, the church door was the community bulletin board. It was the same as him posting, "I lost my cat, reward $5, right? That was just the place to do it. So he's probably standing there tapping his little tack in with his 95 thesis. Someone walks by, "Morning, Father Martin." Morning, right? It's just a normal day. He had no intention of starting a reformation or changing the church forever. He literally made a list of 95 things that he was willing to engage in debate in. Right? That was intramural sports back then. They didn't have soccer and football programs. They had debate. All your colleges basically were theological in nature. So they were written in Latin because that was the language of the church. So Luther puts up his challenge to debate, and he walks away. And by some happy accident of God's providence, a man walks by who can read Latin and starts reading them and says, "Hey man, this stuff is fire." And he takes it down, translates them into German, and he just so happens to have access to a printing press and prints millions of them and sends them out across Germany. And 3 weeks later, the Pope has read these 95 theses down in Italy. That's how the Reformation started. It was a pure accident. So I bring that up to say, don't overestimate the happy accidents in life. There are no coincidences, only God's hand at work. So Mordecai overhears the conversation of the two guards, which for some reason are upset with King Xerxes and hatch a plan to kill him. We're not told why, we're not told what happened, none of that. Just the guards don't like him anymore. So Mordecai tells Esther, who in turn reports it to Xerxes on Mordecai's half. The king has it investigated, and it turns out it's got traction. It's true. So Xerxes has the two guys hung on a gallows, and when I read this for the first time, my brain immediately went, wait a minute, they didn't hang them high in the 800 or 479 BC, I guess. And so I had to do some digging on that. Basically, the Persians would take you and attach you to a wooden stake somehow. whether they tie you or nail you and basically leave you out there for the birds to pick, or they would impale you. And that's what the word gallows there is meant to get across, I guess. It's a little more friendly than a physical description. But it's basically a primitive form of crucifixion. So these two men are executed for their treason and for conspiring against the king. And Xerxes has it recorded in his Chronicles of the Kings of Persia. And so that finishes chapter 2, right? It's kind of an isolated story, and then you start chapter 3, which starts a new story. So now in chapter 3, after this, Xerxes promotes Haman to basically be the second in command of the kingdom, right? It says he put Haman over all the princes that are there with him. We're not told why. I have no idea what Haman did to earn this honor, just that it happened. There's no explanation. And we touched on this the very first teaching on Esther. So I'm going to quiz you guys and see how you're retaining. Haman is said to be an Agagite. Who remembers what that means? Anyone? So it means he's of the bloodline of Agag, who was the king of the Amalekites when Saul was sent to utterly destroy the Amalekites. This is ringing a bell, right? If you want to review that story, that is in 1 Samuel chapter 15. But I bring that up, I want to remind you guys, the whole reason this story could take place is because Saul failed to do what he was told to do, right? Saul was told, utterly destroy the Amalekites, devote them to destruction, and if he had followed the command of God and God's prophet Samuel, none of this would have happened because there would have been no bloodline of the Amalekites for Haman to come out of. Saul's failure to obey God 600 years prior is still working for God's purposes, right? Think about that. God raised up Haman to this position of authority so that he can use an obedient Jewish girl to rescue his people and finish off the Amalekites once and for all. But when we say God is patient, do you ever sit down and think about what that really means? How patient God really is? Or do we just take it for granted? Yeah, God's patient. The King James Version usually renders the word patient as long-suffering. And I do like that word better than patient because it better illustrates what's meant. God is long-suffering toward us. He's willing to endure and wait for the right time to come around before his plans take their full form. After the fall in the Garden of Eden, there were over 4,000 years of human existence, suffering, fighting, sinning, and disobedience that God endured until the right time so that he could send his Messiah, his son Jesus. And Jesus had to come at the time in history when he did. Otherwise, all the prophecies of him could not have been fulfilled and the gospel could not have spread the way it did. God sent his son at the right time in history to accomplish his purpose on our behalf. And so the line of Agag the Amalekite had to endure until 479 BC, just so Esther could be elevated properly and God's purposes could be fulfilled. Think about the Exodus. God tells Moses to tell Pharaoh, I have raised you up for my own purpose, so that he could harden him and crush him. All right, verses 2 through 4. Haman's been promoted, and we read in verse 2 that the king had commanded that the people should bow down before Haman. They should prostrate themselves before him when he comes by, right? This is to get on your knees and literally lay out across the ground and bow. That was a pretty common custom in the ancient Near East, to bow before someone. It was a way of showing respect and submission to that person. Once you get into medieval Europe, it becomes kneeling, right? Kneel before your king. Same basic idea. However, Mordecai refuses to extend this courtesy to Haman, and we're not really told why. We'll talk about the why after we finish through verses 4. But the men in the king's gate actually took the time to ask Mordecai, why are you disobeying the king's order? Why won't you bow down to Haman? And we don't get a direct response. The way verse 4 is worded, Mordecai basically says, well, because I'm a Jew. And so the men report that to Haman to see if his word would stand, right? So basically to say, we'll see if he gets away with this. He says he's a Jew and that's why he won't bow down. We'll see. He's breaking the law. By refusing to follow the command of the king, Mordecai is breaking the law and can be punished for it. I mean, disobeying the direct command of the king would probably land you pretty hot water. I don't know. I think Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego got thrown in the fiery furnace by Nebuchadnezzar when they refused his command. Maybe Xerxes wouldn't have been quite so harsh with them, but if anything, it'd get you thrown in a nasty pit or a jail. So now let's talk about the why. Mordecai would not bow down before Haman because Mordecai was a Jew. Let's talk about what that means. All right, when we talked about the Trinity, I talked to you guys about the central doctrines of the faith, right? The first one was monotheism. That is one God. We are monotheists to the core. We believe in one God, no others, right? Think Deuteronomy 6:4. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our God, Yahweh is one. The Jews were forbidden in the Ten Commandments to worship idols, right? Explicit prohibition. In Exodus 20, verse 5, depending on your translation, it will either read, you shall not worship an idol, or you shall not bow down to an idol. My understanding is that the Hebrew word means literally to bow down or prostrate yourself. The word we translate worship. So there's a clear prohibition against bowing down to anything other than the one true God. You guys tracking with me so far? So keep this in mind. At the time, the Jewish people are spread out across the Persian Empire because in the past they were deported by the Babylonians and Assyrians. Why did God let the Jewish people be deported and exiled out of Israel? In a word, idolatry. Israel, let's run through the history just briefly, fast, high-level overview. They leave Egypt in the Exodus. Moses goes up on the mountain to get the law. They build the golden calf. Idolatry, days later. Then, as they're making their way through the wilderness up toward the promised land, they come to Moab, and King Balak calls Balaam to curse them, and he can't. So Balaam tells Balak, send your women after him. And they fall into idolatry again. They haven't even made it to the promised land, and they're already guilty of idolatry twice. Then they're told to utterly destroy as they go in to take the promised land. Joshua goes in at the Battle of Ai. Someone's got stuff hidden in his tent. More idolatry. And it goes on and on and on. Solomon is respected as one of the greatest kings of Israel, right? He built the temple and fell into idolatry following his wives. And from Solomon's death until today, Israel has suffered from idolatry. Northern and southern kingdoms were always split. You read about all those bad kings. What made them so bad? They fell into idolatry, worshiping idols, bowing down before something else. Sorry, I'll get to the conclusion of it here in a second. My point is, all that history of idolatry would have been right close in the mind of every Jewish person scattered across the Persian Empire waiting to return home to Israel. They knew that was their punishment. The prophets had told them so. So Mordecai said, no, I will not bow down to anything but God Almighty. I decline. So I've got two major things I want you guys to take away from this. Right? I know it's kind of a short teaching, but it's where it broke up that made sense. Two major things for you guys to take away. Don't forget the exhortation we received from the apostles in the New Testament to respect civil authority and be good citizens in the place we live. We should do that. We see Mordecai do that at the end of chapter 2, right? He hears of a plot against the king. That's an illegal thing. He turns him in, right? Our call is to live peaceably and quietly so long as it depends upon us and we submit to the proper legal authority of the government. This means you should obey the speed limit, pay your taxes, serve on jury duty, and vote. It is part of your service to God to do what's required of you by your government so long as it does not force you to disobey God. That's not to say you can't exercise the rights the government has acknowledged and given to you, right? Our country was founded by God-loving men and women who believed in the freedom of conscience and free exercise of religion. However, it was framed and created by a populace that was dedicated to God and His ways. This is a Christian nation. It was founded on Christian principles. The reason your right to free speech and free exercise of religion are enshrined in the Constitution is because the founders of the country believed it is your right given to you by God Himself. But you are to do those things in a peaceful manner in accordance with the Scripture. We are to be people known for our love, not for raucous behavior and outspokenness. Don't get me wrong. I think there's a lot of issues in this country where we've taken that to the extreme and rolled over and gotten steamrolled. However, if you feel the need to get loud about something in a public place, please let that desire, let that fire, that ambition make you loud for the gospel. Don't tell people that they're wrong. Show them the light that will teach them they're wrong. Show them Jesus. Steer people toward the love of Christ and the salvation that He provides. We have serious problems in this country, but the primary one is that there aren't enough people who believe in Christ and are willing to live a life that honors Him in the way He directed us to in His Scriptures. All right, second thing. Notice the example of Mordecai in not backing down when it comes to the things of God. Okay? And that's the tension I was talking about with the revolutionaries, right? Obeying the government and then knowing when it's okay to disobey. Christ told us, render to Caesar what is Caesar's and render to God what is God's. Mordecai is our example of both sides of the same coin. Proper civil obedience and proper civil disobedience. Notice, Mordecai didn't give any great speeches or go on tirades about how the king's policy tramples on his rights. He just simply refused to submit in this particular manner. He would not bow down before anyone but God. Our job as Christians is to stand before the world and declare that there is one God who has revealed Himself as Father, Son, and Spirit, and the three are one. They deserve our worship, adoration, and service. And we bow to no other. We're to be steady in our faith as Mordecai was. And we see that example in the New Testament, right? Peter and John get arrested, brought before the Sanhedrin, beaten, threatened. Don't preach in this name anymore. And what does Peter tell them? I don't know whether it's right or not to obey man over God, but we're going to obey God. And they walk away and keep preaching Jesus. That's the example we're to follow. Think about the early church, the martyrs. They were told, all you have to do is say this phrase, take a little pinch out of the bowl and drop it on the candle. You're free to go. Right? Little pinch of incense, say Kaiser Kurios, Caesar is Lord. You're free. Christians wouldn't do it. There's only one Lord. Christians say Iesus Kyrios, Jesus is Lord. There's no other, we will proclaim no other. Mordecai offers us yet another great example of a man who refused to blaspheme his God to avoid entanglements with the government. I don't know how many of you remember, it's been over a year ago, I read you guys the martyrdom of Polycarp. Right? It was a story of a Polycarp being burned at the stake. Polycarp was on trial for being a Christian and openly admitted he was. The proconsul looks at Polycarp, and I quote, says, "Take the oath and I will release you. Revile Christ." Polycarp responded, 86 years I have served him, and he has done me no wrong. How could I blaspheme my king who saved me? Adopt that mindset. Try to live by it. You'll do well. That's it. Short tonight. Questions? Comments? That was amazing. Concerns? Criticisms? Rebukes? All right. Well, let's pray and we'll be dismissed.